Hello, in this video we're looking at oil, Norway and sovereign funds. The reason for this is that the Scottish Government are proposing to set up what they call an energy fund under independence, where a proportion of the oil and gas tax receipts are invested for the long-term benefits of the people of Scotland, according to the manifesto. And the Scottish Government cites the example of Norway, which has a very large sovereign oil fund. So this video compares Scotland's oil economy with that of Norway because they're quite different in some important ways, so that voters can put the proposed energy fund into context. Here's a graph of the UK's historical oil revenues, and the key thing to look at here really is this axis. In billions of pounds, you see that the highest revenue historically is probably of the order of about £12 billion coming to the UK. And we know under independence, Scotland would get about 90% of the UK's revenue. Let's now compare the UK and Norway in terms of revenue. The blue figures here are exactly the same ones as were in the last slide. The only thing that's changed is the axis, because we're now also showing Norway's revenues in red, and you see they are much bigger than the oil revenues that the UK makes. In fact, if you average it over recent years, they're bigger by a factor of 4, and they get as high as over 30 to 40 billion pounds per year. So an obvious question is, why does Norway have so much more revenue from oil than the UK? Well, you might think it's due to higher production. There's just more oil in Norway. Well, that's not the case. In fact, the converse is true. The UK's peak production was over 5 million barrels per day, and Norway's highest production was got to 3.4 million barrels a day in 2001. The real reason for Norway's enormous revenue is due to two things. One, the direct state participation in the oil industry, and secondly, the tax regime. And the combination of these things ensures that most of the extraction revenues actually come to the state. So first of all, on the tax, the total tax rate in Norway for oil production is 78% going to the government, which is quite a bit higher than it is in the UK. But the other huge factor is, unlike the UK, the state in Norway takes a direct financial interest in production. The state retains a share in all the licenses that it grants for production in the North Sea. And it has over 150 licenses in which it has a direct share. What that means is that the state pays its share of all the investments and the costs to develop the oil field, and in return the government then receives a matching share of the revenue from the sale of the production. And right now the total share of production which belongs to the Norwegian state rather than to any oil company is 28%. It also owns 62% of the shares in the largest oil company in Norway, which is Statoil. So if you boil this down, really what we're saying is that the revenue comes not only from taxes, like in the UK, but also in Norway. The Norwegian state is actually in the oil business, and sometimes that's referred to as a model known as state capitalism. So this has got some important consequences. If we look at Norway's budget, if this is the bar, which is the amount of money which it spends, the amount of money it brings in revenue is actually a bigger amount than that when you include the oil. What that means is that the surplus can be paid into a savings fund or a sovereign fund. And if you look at the detail of this, the oil revenues actually make up 37% of the total revenue, which is higher than in the UK. The revenues is higher than the spending amount, so there's an annual budget surplus, and in 2013 that surplus amounted to £24 billion. The excess amount can be diverted to the sovereign fund, and the first transfer was made back in 1996. And now, as a result of the surplus being built up in a savings fund, the total size of that fund is now £470 billion, and it's reckoned to be the largest sovereign fund of its kind in the world. The picture in an independent Scotland is really quite different. If this is the spending line, the revenue line is actually lower than spending. So Scotland spends more than it brings in revenue, including the revenue from oil, which remember is a smaller amount than Norway. The net effect of that is that Scotland has to borrow money in the form of debt. So the details here are Scotland's oil revenue is 15% of the total revenue it brings in currently. The spending is higher than the revenue, so there's a budget deficit, which in 2012-13 amounted to £12 billion, and that deficit has to be made up really by borrowing money from the markets. So the Scottish Government proposals that have been published in the Independence Manifesto talk about two separate things really. First of all, the government would propose under independence to create what's called a stabilisation fund. The purpose of this is to insulate the budget from year-on-year fluctuations in the oil revenue. So in good years, when you make more money from oil, you save some of that money away, so that in lean years, when you make less than you hoped, you can use that money you've put away to kind of smooth out the budget, and that will protect the budget from the volatility of the oil revenues. The second part of the proposal is to set up the savings fund or sovereign fund. Now, if you look at the actual publication for this, which is the Scottish Government's Fiscal Commission Working Group, where these proposals come from, some direct quotes from there take account of the picture we've just looked at, that the Scottish economy actually runs a deficit. So what they say is that the investments into a savings fund would not necessarily require Scotland to be in budget surplus. They also say that investments could be started when the budget deficit was reduced and debt was on a downward trajectory. In essence, they're saying that setting up the fund would be done by borrowing money, and the report also says that the government would consider starting to make modest investments towards the end of this decade. And it goes on to say that the ultimate aim should be for Scotland to run some form of onshore budget balance, meaning that if you take oil out of the picture, then the budget would be balanced, just taking account of the other things. However, it's also important to realise that the economic plans don't actually show a particular time when this would happen. This is more of an aspirational statement than an actual plan. Thank you very much.